Good morning. As we prepare for annual conference session of the Baltimore-Washington Conference, which will begin tomorrow in Baltimore, we want to continue our videos to help you understand what's going to be happening at annual conference. Beginning tomorrow and throughout the annual conference session, I'll be posting videos throughout the day on breaks during session to let you know what's happening and to keep you posted about the events and any decisions whatever decisions happen during our annual conference session. Today, I want to share with you a little bit about what happens at the executive session of clergy at annual conference. My husband, who's been a lay person in the United Methodist Church throughout his life, when I asked him, what do you think we should talk about? What questions do you have? He said, I never really know what happens at executive session, at clergy session. And so I want to spend some time just sharing a bit with you about that today. Now, the Book of Discipline refers to this session as the executive session of the clergy. You might hear people refer to it either as the executive session or the clergy session. Clergy session is probably more descriptive and puts it kind of in line with the laity session that meets at the same time. But when you hear either of those terms, they mean the same thing. Now, the executive session or the clergy session is a gathering that happens at the annual conference session, or sometimes it's held at a different time, but it's tied to the work of the annual conference, in which the clergy of the annual conference gather to discuss, as the Book of Discipline calls it, the ordination, character, and conference relations of clergy in our annual conference. Now, what that means is that we have to, as the clergy, have oversight over the statuses of clergy in our annual conference. Now, when that group gathers, it is considered a closed session, and that's why the laity have a session at a separate time. And so within that closed session, when we meet, all full clergy members of the conference, full elders and full deacons have both voice and vote. There are other types of clergy who are generally able to be seated with voice, but no vote. That includes local pastors and provisional elders or deacons, affiliate members, as well as there are a small group of lay people who have voice and vote within the clergy session. And those are the lay persons who are members of the Board of Ordained Ministry. You see, the clergy session and the work that is done there is really the product and is the drawing to completion of the work of our Conference Board of Ordained Ministry, the work of the board subcommittee, the Conference Relations Committee, sometimes referred to as CRC, as well as our district committees on ministry. It's our district committees on ministry that oversee persons seeking ordination at the earliest stages of that process. It's also our district committees on ministry that oversee our local pastors who serve many of our churches. The Board of Ordained Ministry is the body that oversees the work of the district committees on ministry, and it is the body that examines persons who are coming for commissioning as deacons or elders in the United Methodist Church through the Baltimore-Washington Conference. So that's the sort of work that is done, but that may still seem a bit amorphous and vague to you. So let me tell you tangibly what happens. So tomorrow on Wednesday at 1:30, sometime, I think some folks maybe heard 2 p.m., but at 1:30 tomorrow at Wednesday, the first thing after the pre-conference sessions, the pre-conference classes for those who are taking those tomorrow, at 1:30, the clergy and those other categories of folks that I mentioned are going to be gathering for the executive session or the clergy session. Now, as a full elder, when I check in for annual conference, I get my name tag, and like everybody at annual conference, my name tag has a ribbon that displays my status. And so full deacons and elders have generally in our annual conference blue ribbons. As a Duke grad, I appreciate that they're nice Duke blue. But other statuses, folks may have yellow ribbons or Our Lady. Everybody has a ribbon so that it can easily be seen what their status is, because only certain people are allowed into that session. As I mentioned, it's a closed session. It's not a confidential session. Information is printed in the conference journal. Information is shared later at annual conference about what happens, but it's a closed session. And that means that only those who are eligible to be present with voice or no vote or voice and vote are going to be allowed into the room where that meeting happens. And that work is done of making sure the right people are in that room is done by our marshals. Our marshals do important work throughout the duration of our annual conference session, making sure that persons who need to be in voting areas or who need to be in certain areas are able to be in, and to make sure that folks who shouldn't be in certain areas aren't allowed in. So the first time you're going to meet the marshals is for the clergy session. And so as a clergy, when I show up, I'm going to need to show them my badge to show them that I am eligible to enter into the room, the ballroom, where the meeting is held. And if somebody tries to get in who's not allowed to get in, then they'll politely say, no, you can't come in. Don't be rude to the marshals. They are doing important work for the conference, and many of them have been serving for many years. They understand very well who should be and shouldn't be in different spaces, and they don't make the rules. So if you try to get into the clergy session and you shouldn't be there, the marshals aren't going to let you in the door. In that session, as I show my name badge that has my ribbon on it, they'll allow me in, and as I enter, I'll likely be handed a printed packet that includes what's called the executive session report. And I was going to print a previous packet to show you, but it's 50 pages to show you how thick it was. So, I mean, it's not that thick. So 50 pages, that's how long this report is. And so the work of the executive session is to work through the executive session report, which reflects the statuses of clergy persons in the annual conference. Now, there are two rules of the executive session report. The first rule is we don't talk about, that's Fight Club. Okay, the two rules of the executive session report. It is that every person, every clergy person needs to have a status. You have to have some status, and you can only have one status. And so there are a list of questions. These come from the Book of Discipline, a list of questions, and persons have to be listed or considered under all of these questions. And so the work of preparing the executive session report is done ahead of time by the chairs of our district committees on ordained ministry, our cabinet, our Episcopal office, our Board of Ordained Ministry, our CRC, and all of that work goes into this 50-some page executive session report. Now, if all the work is done perfectly, then there are no corrections to be made to the executive session report, and we simply move through and vote on those items that need votes. Of those 50 pages, many of the pages have only informational items. So for example, informational items about who has retired or who has passed away, things that don't require a vote. But there are a number of pieces which do require a vote. And on those questions, so as the report goes through, on those questions that do require a vote, the report specifically outlines what kind of a vote is needed. Some items require just a majority vote. Those might be, for example, granting a continuation of a leave that's already been given. If some require a supermajority, a 2/3 majority, so in that case, I think actually if a full member is on a family leave, if they've been on family leave for a certain number of years, then to continue, they need a supermajority vote. But per the General Conference in the Book of Discipline, any votes affecting a change in status require a 3/4 vote. And so in the executive session, what really we're looking for is a large majority, 3/4 of those voting members, those full members of the annual conference, as well as the lay members of the Board of Ordained Ministry, 3/4 of those have to vote on any changes in status. So changes in status or approval for commissioning or ordination. And so what we'll do is our bishop, along with our conference secretary, will be seated up front, kind of like annual conference. The chair of our Board of Ordained Ministry, and sometimes other folks will be present as well, and we'll begin working through those questions. Now, most of what happens in the executive session isn't all that controversial. We're say, hey, who gets to retire? And we always joke about, hey, well, we have to approve your retirement. But it's kind of fun. It's exciting to celebrate people's ministry. It's exciting to celebrate persons who are entering into ministry or reaching that point of commissioning and ordination, those persons who have been approved as local pastors by their district committees. So much of what happens in the executive session, in the clergy session, includes votes, but it really is a celebration of work. Also, as we move through the report, as I mentioned, in a perfect world, everything is correct. But as good Methodists, we say we're moving on to perfection. There is an immense amount of information, as you can imagine, in the 50-some page executive session report. And so there are occasionally things that have to be corrected. And so as we go through, it's important that those who are present for the clergy session carefully read each section as we go through, not only for the parts of the report that we require a vote, but also for those reports that are informational. Because the executive session report is our official document. It needs to be correct. And so that's the work of the body is to perfect that report so that we can in the end vote on it as an entirety. So we'll move through that report, having also heard a report from the chair of our Board of Ordained Ministry about the work of that board over the preceding year. The executive session, the clergy session, to be honest, is a session that I look forward to because it's a great opportunity to catch up with colleagues. And so it's fun kind of gathering, seeing who's there, and it's often, though not always, held as the first session as annual conference. And so it's often the first chance we get to see everybody. And so there's a lot of excitement that comes with that. But there's also hard work that happens at the executive session. As you might imagine, the discussions that are had at the executive session affect people in very personal ways. And so when we're talking about persons who are being discontinued in ministry or persons who have withdrawn from the office of elder or deacon, or those are very difficult decisions. And so in the executive session, we often in those change of statuses may hear a little bit of information. Sometimes folks push for questions, but really it's kind of like a giant human resources meeting. And so the work of the Board of Ordained Ministry is confidential, like the SPRC, the Staff Parish Relations Committee in a local church. And so part of the line that is walked in the executive session, even with all the clergy there, is how to share enough information so that people can make a reasonable and informed decision and vote. But also how to honor the privacy of some of the information that played into some of the changes in status that are on the report. Also, the way that we have received and heard candidates for ministry, for provisional and full membership, for commissioning and ordination, changes over the years. Sometimes, as those persons have come forward, sometimes they're received as an entire group and voted on as an entire group. Sometimes, in some years, those persons have had questions asked of them from the floor, and so, in some years, not. And those precedents and how we handle candidates coming forward are particularly important this year, as they have been in past years, as our conference, like others, considers how we are going to approach the denominational discussions and provisions around ministry with LGBTQ persons. Last year at clergy session, there were two candidates that our bishop said that the clergy session could not vote on because of their relational status. The Judicial Council earlier this year in February, citing the importance of the separation of powers, said that the bishop was not allowed to prevent votes on those persons. But there continues to be, I think, a little bit of lack of clarity and also some questions as to how the Judicial Council is applying that idea of separation of power, given how they ruled in that decision. And that's, if you want to read the ruling, it's decision 1368. contrasting with some of their rulings related to the traditional plan and some provisions and how they really are understanding separation of powers. And so the work of the executive session is the work of statuses, to determine status. It's a reflection of that separation of power that the Judicial Council talked about, which also guides the work of the Board of Ordained Ministry and the cabinet throughout the year. The general way that we understand that is that the Board of Ordained Ministry, and that work then affirmed or not in the executive session report, that the Board of Ordained Ministry and the executive session govern status, and the bishop and cabinet oversee appointment. And those two things are related, but they are not the same. And those decisions are made separately. So the Board of Ordained Ministry and the executive session determines status, and it's complicated because there's a whole lot of input that goes into that. And the bishop and cabinet make appointments. So those are related, but there's separate processes. So the executive session meets to work through all of those pieces. And there have been a couple of times, I believe in the past few decades, where the executive session has gone into completely closed status, where persons who did not have voting right were not allowed in the session. That has not generally happened, but there are a couple times, at least one that I can remember when I was a teenager, so I wasn't in the clergy session, where there was very tight security on who was able to be in, and there's kind of a group of people who are like allowed in executive session, and those persons were excluded then. That does not generally happen, to go into completely closed session. So in that closed session, the idea is that the persons who are in the executive session shouldn't be communicating with people, like pretend that social media doesn't exist, pretend that cell phones don't exist. So if it's a closed session, then in the walls of that session, everybody should be focused on the business of hand and not communicating with folks outside the session. Once the session is over, again, it's not a confidential session, but it is a closed session that only certain people are able to be part of and to be present in the discussions for what is happening there in the closed session. So that's some of the work that happens in the executive session. There was certainly a lot of argument and debate last year, largely around the question of the two candidates, one for commissioning and one for ordination, there were questions around the Book of Disciplines, policy around the ordination or really even candidacy of LGBTQ persons. And our conference and Board of Ordained Ministry, as well as a number of other conferences, have pushed the envelope around our understanding and implementation of those portions of the Book of Discipline. And this will no doubt be an important topic in the clergy session this year. So the work of that body will be shared after the executive session has ended. So that's a little bit about the executive session. And so I won't be broadcasting from inside that session, nor during our breaks, but when the session is over, we'll be able to give some updates about the work of that. As you might imagine, even though that session is not considered confidential, the discussions that are there do touch on some sometimes very sensitive and personal information of persons who are involved. And so you will find that persons who have been present for that session are rightfully hold that information close to the vest. I really see it, and I think many of us really see it, like I mentioned, as kind of the human resources gathering, for the annual conference in terms of our clergy members. And so it is important that we respect not only information that might be shared in that session, but also the discussions and discernment of those present in that body. All of those present take that work very seriously. And so you'll see updates, but know that if you ask somebody who's been in that session, hey, what happened? That they may be very careful about how they describe what happened in that session, because we want to be responsible and respectful to each other and to the persons who are described in that session. So I hope that you will be praying for our bishop, the chair of our Board of Ordained Ministry, for all who are present in that executive session, in that clergy session. Prayers especially for our commissioning and our class of those being recommended for commissioning and those being recommended for ordination. Prayers also in particular for our candidates who are continuing in the process as they are caught within the denomination's tension around the exclusionary language in the Book of Discipline regarding ministry to and with LGBTQ persons. The executive session is the place where our discussions around the Book of Discipline really do go from being theoretical to being very clearly personal and very difficult decisions and very direct decisions as an annual conference. That work is done there in the executive session. So your prayers for all of those persons and for all who are gathered are most welcome. And as we continue to prepare for annual conference, I might post another video or two as we get ready to begin sessions. But again, the clergy session, the executive session begins at 1:30 tomorrow on Wednesday. And that session is scheduled to meet until dinner time, till about 5 o'clock. And then there'll be a dinner break. The laity session is meeting about that same time. They don't have official business or vote to do, but they are going to be led, my understanding is, by Marcia McPhee, who is just a leader in worship arts, not only in the United Methodist Church, but certainly as one of our leaders in the United Methodist Church. And then we'll have a dinner break, and then we'll have opening worship tomorrow evening. That's scheduled to begin at 7 p.m. And beginning with opening worship, the sessions will be live streamed on the conference webpage. So if you're not able to be present, if you're not there as a member of the conference, then you can follow along throughout not only worship, but also the sessions. The only session that is closed and so won't be broadcast is that clergy session, that executive session tomorrow afternoon. So opening worship begins tomorrow at 7 p.m. And then we'll have worship and plenary sessions throughout Thursday and Friday. And then Saturday is a day that we'll be focusing on young people's ministry. And so all of that will be able to be live streamed so that you can follow along at home. If there's anything else that you have questions about that you would like me to touch on before we start annual conference or throughout the session, please don't hesitate to let me know in comments or to message me. I look forward to spending the next few days with you as we move together through the annual conference session of the Baltimore-Washington Conference. Thanks.